You sat down last session with a full stack. You played for 6 hours. You made what felt like solid decisions. You avoided the drunk guy's traps. You folded when you sensed danger. You even made a few nice value bets that got called. And yet somehow you walked out down 3 buy-ins. Or maybe you broke even. Or maybe you won a little but felt like you should have won a lot more. And on the drive home, you told yourself the same story you always tell yourself. You ran bad. The cards didn't cooperate. That one river was brutal. You did everything right, and the poker gods just weren't on your side. Let me tell you something that might sting. You didn't run bad. You gave money away. Not in one dramatic hand. Not in some spectacular blow-up. You gave it away in dozens of tiny moments you didn't even notice. You donated it through habits so ingrained you think they're correct. You leaked it through decisions that felt neutral but were actually negative. And the worst part is, you've been doing this for months, maybe years, every single session. This is not a video about bad beats. This is not a video about variance. This is not a video that will teach you what a continuation bet is or why position matters in some abstract theoretical sense. If you're looking for beginner content, leave now. This video is for players who already know how to play poker but can't figure out why their results don't match their understanding. This is for the player who studies, who thinks, who tries to improve, and who still watches money evaporate session after session without understanding where it goes. I'm going to show you exactly where your money disappears, not the obvious spots, the invisible ones, the leaks that feel like standard play. The decisions that seem fine in the moment but compound into thousands of dollars lost over time. By the end of this video, you're going to look back at your last 10 sessions and realize you've been making donations you didn't even know were possible. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You will never play the same way again. The game you think you're playing and the game that's actually happening at the table are two different things. You think you're making strategic decisions based on hand strength and position and opponent tendencies. But most of the time, you're making comfort decisions. You're making autopilot decisions. You're making decisions based on what you've always done, rather than what the specific situation demands. And every single one of those moments is money walking out of your stack and into someone else's. Here's the truth that winning players understand and losing players resist. Your edge in live poker doesn't come from the big hands. It comes from the accumulation of small advantages in marginal situations. And if you're neutral in those situations, if you're just playing standard without intention, you're not breaking even. You're losing, because the rake exists, because better players are exploiting those same margins against you, because the game itself is designed to grind down anyone who isn't actively, consciously, deliberately extracting value from every single decision. There's a phrase that costs poker players more money than any bad beat or cooler ever could. 5 words that feel completely reasonable when you say them, but actually represent the most expensive delusion in the game. I didn't make any big mistakes. You've said it. I've said it. Every player who's ever walked away from a session wondering where the money went has said it. And every time we say it, we're protecting ourselves from a truth we don't want to face. The absence of big mistakes does not equal good poker. Not even close. You can play an entire session without making a single obviously bad decision and still lose money at a significant rate. Because the game isn't about avoiding disasters, it's about optimizing decisions. And there's a massive gap between not punting and actually playing well. Think about your last session. You probably remember the big hands, the set over set, the river that counterfeited your 2-pair, the bluff that got snapped off. Those moments are vivid because they involve large pots and emotional intensity. But what about the 40 other hands you played? What about the 70 hands you folded pre-flop? What about the 10 small pots you won or lost without much thought? You don't remember them. They felt routine. They felt like nothing happened. But something did happen. In every single one of those forgotten hands, you made decisions. You chose to fold or call or raise. You chose a specific sizing. You chose whether to continue or give up. And in most of those decisions, you weren't optimizing. You were defaulting. You were doing what you always do without asking whether it was the best play in that specific situation against that specific opponent at that specific moment. This is where money goes, not in the hands you remember, but in the ones you forget. The calls that were slightly too loose. the folds that were slightly too tight, the bet sizes that were slightly too small, the river checks that let opponents realize equity they shouldn't have been allowed to see. None of these feel like mistakes. They feel like standard play. But standard play in live poker is losing play. Standard play means you're playing the same way against everyone, in every situation, regardless of dynamics. Let me give you a concrete example. You open ace-queen from middle position. The button calls. The flop comes king 7-3 rainbow. You continuation bet half pot because that's what you always do with your range on dry boards. The button calls. The turn is a 5. You check because you don't have a king and the button called the flop. The river is a 2. You check again. The button checks back and wins with king-jack. Nothing about that hand feels like a mistake. You bet the flop with your equity and backdoors. You checked the turn when you didn't improve. You gave up the river when it was clear you were behind. Standard play. And yet, you probably lost more money than necessary. Because you never asked who the button is. Is this an opponent who floats flops wide and folds turns? If so, a turn barrel prints money. Is this an opponent who only calls flops with strong hands? If so, why are you betting the flop at all with ace-queen? Your standard line assumed an average opponent in an average situation. But there are no average opponents. There are only specific players with specific tendencies at specific moments. There's a leak in your game that you've never studied. You've never reviewed it in a database. You've never discussed it with your poker friends. You've never even thought about it as a category of decision. And yet it costs you more money per hour than almost any other aspect of your play. It's the hands you play from the blinds when facing a raise. Most players focus their study time on opening ranges, 3-betting strategies, continuation betting frequencies, and river decisions. Those are important. But they're also the areas where competent players have narrowed their leaks significantly. If you've studied at all, your button opening range is probably close to optimal. Your 3-bet sizing from the cutoff is probably reasonable. You've thought about these things because content creators and coaches talk about them constantly. But blind defense? That's the orphan spot. The spot nobody wants to think about because it's inherently uncomfortable. You're out of position. You've already put money in the pot. Someone has shown aggression. And now you have to decide whether to call with a hand that's probably not amazing, knowing you'll play the rest of the hand at a disadvantage. What do most players do? They either defend too wide because they don't want to let people push them around, or they defend too tight because they don't want to play out of position with marginal hands. Both approaches cost money. But the more common leak, especially in live poker, is defending too wide with hands that can't realize their equity against the types of opponents you're actually facing. Here's what I mean. Online, when you defend the big blind with king 7 suited against a cutoff open, you're facing a range, a theoretical construction based on position and statistics, and against that range, king 7 suited performs a certain way. It has certain implied odds, certain blocker effects, certain opportunities to outplay your opponent post-flop. Live poker doesn't work like that. When you defend the big blind with king 7 suited against the 40-year-old guy in the cutoff who's playing 12% of hands and only opens when he has something real, you're not defending against a range. You're defending against actual strength. And your king 7 suited is going to get crushed post-flop because this opponent doesn't continuation bet with air, doesn't fold to check raises without a hand, and doesn't pay off your draws when they get there. But you defend it anyway, because you defend your blinds, because that's what good players do, because you saw it on a training video somewhere. And every time you do it against the wrong opponent, you're donating chips. Not in a dramatic way. Just a slow, steady bleed that you don't track because you're too focused on the big pots. You understand that position matters. Every poker player who spent more than a week studying the game understands this on an intellectual level. You know that being last to act provides information advantages. You know that you can realize more equity in position. You know that playing hands from the button is better than playing them from under the gun. This is basic stuff. You've got it covered. But knowing that position matters and actually using position correctly are two completely different things. And most players, even players who consider themselves competent, bleed chips through positional misunderstanding constantly. Not because they don't know position exists, but because they don't adjust their entire strategy based on position. They play the same hand slightly differently from different positions instead of playing entirely different games. Here's what I mean. When you're in position against a single opponent, you have complete control over the pot. You decide whether it grows or stays small. You decide whether the turn and river get checked through or bet. You decide the story of the hand. And most players waste this control by playing the same fit or fold, value or bluff style they play from every other position. In position, your checking range should be much wider than you think. When you flop middle pair in position against a tight player who check-called the flop, you don't need to bet the turn. You can happily take a free card, control the pot size, and see a cheap showdown. But most players bet because they have a hand. They bet because that's what you do when you hit the flop. And they turn a profitable situation into a marginal one by bloating the pot against a range that's never folding worse. Conversely, when you're out of position, pot control becomes much harder. You can't check and see what happens. If you check, your opponent might bet. And now you have to make a decision based on incomplete information. This means your out-of-position strategy should be more polarized. More betting with strong hands and draws. More check folding with marginal holdings. Less checking to see what they do. Because what they do is put you in impossible spots. Live poker amplifies these positional dynamics because of stack depths. With 200 big blinds or more, positional advantages compound. Every street you're out of position is another street where your opponent can make your life difficult. Every street you're in position is another street where you can make perfect decisions based on complete information. Watch the players at your table. The ones constantly stuck. The ones who seem to run bad every session. Notice where they play their big pots from. I guarantee you'll see a pattern. They're building big pots from the blinds. They're calling raises out of position with speculative hands, and then getting trapped on coordinated boards. They're 3-betting from the small blind, and then having no idea what to do when they face resistance on the turn. Your bet sizing is costing you money, not because you're making mathematical errors, but because you've automated your decisions. You have default sizes, a standard open, a standard continuation bet, a standard turn barrel, a standard river value bet, and every time you use those defaults without thinking, you're leaving chips on the table. Bet sizing in live poker is not about balance, it's about extraction. You're not playing against solvers, you're playing against humans with predictable calling patterns and emotional attachment to their hands. Your job is not to construct a theoretically sound betting range at every node. Your job is to get the most money possible from the players who are willing to call and to lose the least possible against players who have you beat. Start with pre-flop. You open to 3 big blinds because that's what you've always done. But why? In some games, you can open to 2 big blinds and get the same respect. In other games, you could open to 5 big blinds and still get 3 callers. The correct size depends on your opponents, not on some abstract sense of what's standard. I've played in live games where the entire table was folding to 2.5x opens. Free money, smaller risk, same result. I've played in other games where opening to 4x still attracted 4 callers. In that second game, if you're opening to 3x with your premium hands, you're building smaller pots with your best holdings against players who would have called more anyway. That's pure value destruction. The same principle applies on every street. Your continuation bet shouldn't be automatic. The size shouldn't be automatic. Against players who fold to any bet, use the minimum necessary. Against players who call any bet, use the maximum you can get called. Against players who only continue with strong hands, why are you continuation betting at all with your air when you could check back and try to steal the pot later? River sizing is where most players leave the most money. You value bet and get called. That feels good. But did you bet the right amount? If you bet half pot and got snap called, what happens if you bet 75%? Does that hand still call? What about pot? You'll never know unless you pay attention to the specific opponent's calling patterns and adjust accordingly. I've watched players value bet $30 into $100 pots and get snap called by second pair. They're happy they won. They got value. But they could have bet $60 and gotten the same call. They could have bet $90. They left an extra $30 or $60 on the table because they used their default instead of thinking about who they were playing against. You're going to hate this section because it's going to describe something you do constantly, something that feels strategic but is actually fear dressed up as poker thinking. I'm talking about comfort calls. The calls you make not because they're profitable, but because folding feels worse than losing. Here's how it works. You raise preflop with pocket jacks. You get one caller in position. The flop comes queen 8-3 with 2 hearts. You continuation bet. They call. The turn is a 7 of hearts, completing the flush draw. You check. They bet 2/3 pot. You tank for a minute and then call. What was your reason for calling? If you're honest, it wasn't a clear strategic rationale. It was something like, I can't fold jacks to 1 bet. It was, maybe they're bluffing. It was, I put in too much already to give up now. These aren't reasons, they're comfort mechanisms. You called because folding felt worse, not because calling was correct. This happens more than you want to admit. You call because you want to see what they have. You call because you're curious. You call because the pot is big, and walking away from it feels like defeat. You call because you've been card dead for an hour and finally had a real hand and you just can't let it go yet. Every single one of these calls costs you money. Not just the chips you lose when they show the flush, but the future chips you're conditioning yourself to donate. Because every time you make a comfort call and it works out, you reinforce the behavior. Every time you call with third pair and they're bluffing, you think good call instead of bad process, lucky result. Winning players fold when it's correct regardless of how it feels. They fold big pairs on scary boards. They fold top pair when the action doesn't make sense. They fold river bets even when the pot is huge. Not because they don't care about the money, but because they understand that one pot is irrelevant. What matters is the pattern. What matters is making the right decision thousands of times over years of play. Fear-based decisions work in both directions. Sometimes you call when you should fold because you're afraid of being bluffed. Sometimes you fold when you should call because you're afraid of being wrong. The common thread is that fear, not logic, is driving the decision. And whenever emotion sits in the driver's seat, your bankroll is the passenger being taken somewhere it doesn't want to go. You think you know what tilt looks like. It's the guy who loses a big pot and immediately shoves the next hand without looking at his cards. It's the player who starts berating the dealer after a bad beat. It's the visible, obvious emotional breakdown that everyone at the table can see and exploit. And because you don't do those things, you think you don't tilt. You're wrong. You tilt constantly. You just don't recognize it because your tilt doesn't look like the stereotype. Your tilt is subtle. It's the slight loosening of your standards after running bad for an hour. It's the marginal call you make because you're frustrated and tired of folding. It's the slightly larger bet you make when you're annoyed at a specific opponent. These micro-tilts don't feel like tilt. They feel like adjustments. They feel like playing your game. But they're not. They're emotional leakage dressed up as strategy. Here's a specific example. You've been completely card dead for 2 hours. You've folded the blinds over and over. You've watched aggressive players splash around while you wait for playable hands that never come. Finally, you look down at King 10, suited in middle position. Is this an open in your normal range from this position? Maybe not. But today, right now, after 2 hours of nothing, it feels like pocket aces. You open. You get 3 bet. You call because you've been waiting forever for a hand. You miss the flop completely. You call a continuation bet because you have backdoors. You fold the turn. You just donated 6 big blinds because impatience disguised itself as having a playable hand. This happens with winning players too, just in different ways. Maybe you're up big in a session. You're playing great, running good. Everything is clicking, and then you start making slightly looser calls because you're playing with house money. You start taking slightly thinner value bets because you feel invincible. You're still ahead for the session, but you're leaking back chips because confidence has morphed into carelessness. The solution isn't to become a robot. It's to build awareness. Before every significant decision, take 1 second to check in with yourself. Am I making this decision based on the current situation, or am I making it based on what happened in the last hour? Am I responding to this hand, or am I responding to my emotions about the session? This single moment of awareness can save you from hundreds of micro-tilt decisions over the course of a year. Every hand of poker you play should have a plan, not a vague intention, not a hope, not a let's see what happens. An actual concrete plan for how you're going to win money in this hand. And if you don't have that plan before you put chips in the pot, you're making a donation. Let me show you what playing without a plan looks like. You're in the cutoff with 7-6 suited. There are 2 limpers. You decide to limp behind because the price is good and you have a speculative hand. What's your plan? You don't have one. You're hoping to flop something. You're hoping to hit a straight or a flush and win a big pot. But hope is not a plan. What happens when the flop comes King 8-2 with one of your suit? You have a backdoor flush draw and 6 high. No pair. No real equity. The first limper bets. The second calls. Now what? You have no idea. You didn't think about this. So you fold and move on to the next hand. You just paid to see a flop that you were never going to win unless you hit perfectly. That's a donation. Now let's play the same hand with a plan. You're in the cutoff with 7-6 suited. There are 2 limpers. You decide to raise. Why? Because you have a plan. You're going to bet most flops. If you get called, you're going to continue on flops that hit your perceived range of big cards. You're going to give up on boards where you have no credible story. You know that if everyone folds, you win immediately. You know that if one person calls and you bet the flop and they fold, you win. You know that even if you get called down and lose, you've built an image that will get you paid when you have a real hand. That's the difference. Same cards, same position, same opponents. Completely different expected value. Not because raising is always better than limping, but because entering the pot with a plan is always better than entering the pot with hope. This extends to every street. When you call a flop bet, what's your plan for the turn? Are you folding to any bet? Are you calling one more street? Are you raising if a specific card comes? If you don't know, you shouldn't be calling. When you bet the turn, what's your plan for the river? Are you betting all rivers? Checking to induce? Sizing down for thin value? If you haven't thought about it, you're improvising. And improvisation in poker is expensive. The players who crush live games aren't necessarily more talented than you. They're more intentional. Every chip they put in the pot is put there for a reason. Every decision connects to a larger plan. And when you play against someone with a plan while you're floating on autopilot, the money flows predictably in one direction. You've studied game theory. You know what balanced ranges look like. You understand polarization. You know about minimum defense frequency. You've watched the solvers construct their impossible perfection, and you've tried to apply these concepts to your live game. You've tried to be balanced. You've tried to be unexploitable, and it's costing you money. Here's the uncomfortable truth about GTO and live poker. It's almost completely irrelevant at the stakes most people play. Not because the theory is wrong, but because the theory assumes optimal opponents, and your opponents are not optimal. They're not even close. They're calling too much or folding too much. They're betting too big or too small. They're completely unaware of what a balanced range even means. And when you play perfectly balanced strategy against wildly unbalanced opponents, you're not maximizing value. You're leaving money on the table. Let me give you a concrete example. Game theory says you should bluff the river some percentage of the time with your missed draws to remain balanced. If you never bluff, opponents can call with confidence whenever you bet. So you need bluffs in your range. Perfectly logical. But here's the problem. The guy at your table who's been calling too much all night? He doesn't know anything about your range. He's not thinking, this opponent never bluffs rivers so I can hero call with third pair. He's thinking, I have a pair, I call. If you bluff him because GTO says you should have bluffs, you're lighting money on fire. Against this player, the correct strategy is to never bluff the river. Ever. Bet your good hands for value, check back your marginal hands, and don't put chips in with air because he's going to call. Conversely, there's another player at your table who folds to every river bet. He's scared of the river. He calls flops and turns but can't pull the trigger when the money gets real. Against this player, you should bluff the river constantly. Every missed draw, every busted gut shot, every hand where you can't win at showdown should turn into a bet. Not because it's balanced, but because it's exploitative. Live poker is not about balance. It's about exploitation. It's about identifying what each opponent does wrong and constructing a strategy that punishes their specific mistakes. GTO is a starting point, a foundation, a way to understand what good poker looks like in a vacuum. But the vacuum doesn't exist. Your table is full of humans with readable tendencies and predictable errors. Ignore them at your own expense. Here's something you've probably never thought about. The best players at your stake don't just make better decisions in difficult spots. They avoid difficult spots entirely. They filter situations. They fold hands that would create problems. They take lines that minimize complexity. And from the outside, this looks like running good. It looks like always having it. It looks like luck. It's not luck. It's discipline. But it's a specific kind of discipline that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the discipline to fold second pair on a scary board. That's decision discipline. This is situation discipline. The discipline to recognize that a hand is going to be difficult to play and to simply not play it. Let me show you what I mean. You're in the small blind with ace-jack offsuit. There's a raise from early position and a call from middle position. What do? Most players either call or 3-bet. Both options lead to difficult situations. If you call, you're going to the flop 3-way out of position with a hand that flops top pair but often can't handle heavy action. If you 3-bet, you're bloating the pot out of position against a range that includes plenty of hands that dominate you. What would a crusher do? Often, they just fold. Not because ace-jack is unplayable, not because they're scared, but because this situation is a nightmare. No matter how the hand develops, you're going to be making marginal decisions for significant pots from the worst position at the table. Why voluntarily enter that world when you can just wait for a better spot? This is the invisible edge. You never see the hands crushers fold. You never see the spots they avoid. You only see the hands they play, which are disproportionately situations where they have positional advantage, or equity advantage, or both. And because you only see them playing in favorable spots, it looks like they always have it. It looks like they're lucky. But they're not lucky. They're selective. The recreational player sees a playable hand and plays it. The winning player sees a playable hand and asks whether the situation is playable. Same cards, different questions, different results. Your job is not to maximize the value of every hand you're dealt. Your job is to maximize the value of every situation you enter. And sometimes the best decision for your overall win rate is to not enter a situation at all. I've shown you where your money goes. The small calls, the autopilot sizing, the hands from the blinds, the positions you misuse, the emotions you don't notice, the plans you don't make, the balance you don't need, the situations you don't avoid. These are your leaks. Not variance, not bad luck, not the cards. You, your decisions, your habits, your defaults. But here's what matters. Now you see it. You can't unsee it. The next time you sit down at a live poker table, you're going to notice things you never noticed before. You're going to catch yourself making a comfort call and stop. You're going to recognize when you're tilting subtly and adjust. You're going to look at your preflop sizing and ask whether it's actually optimal for this specific game. You're going to pause before betting the river and think about who you're betting against and how much they'll call. That awareness is worth money. Real money. Thousands of dollars a year if you play regularly. Not because you're going to become perfect overnight. You won't. But because every leak you plug is pure profit added to your bottom line. Every autopilot decision you replace with an intentional one moves chips from the losing column to the winning column. The game doesn't change. The opponents don't get worse. The cards don't suddenly run better. You change. And that's all it takes. Better decisions. Compounded over thousands of hands, over hundreds of sessions, over years of play. The math takes care of the rest. If this video made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the feeling of growth. If you saw yourself in these leaks, even better. Self-recognition is the first step toward improvement. The players who stay stuck are the ones who watch content like this and think, that's not me. The players who improve are the ones who watch this and think, that's exactly me, and now I know what to do about it. You're not running bad, you've been giving money away, but that ends now. Not because I told you to stop, but because you finally see where the money goes. And once you see it, you can't help but change. If this shifted how you think about your game, hit the like button. Not as a favor to me, but as a marker for yourself that something clicked. Think about your biggest leak right now, the one that cost you the most money, and put it in the comments. Writing it down makes it real. And if you want more content that elevates your thinking instead of insulting your intelligence, subscribe. This channel is for players who want to get better, not players who want to feel better. The money is out there. Stop giving it away. Go take it.